Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Pedigree Foundation Best Practice webinar presented by Kristen Hassen with Austin Pets Alive. My name is Meg Meredith, Grants Manager here at the Pedigree Foundation, and I'll be your host for today's event. We're here today to discuss and learn more about programs that help keep people and pets together. I know it's a busy month for everyone, so thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. So I've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Also, don't forget, you can submit chat questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, but we'll collect these and address them at the end. Okay, and now I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Deb Fair.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited for you guys to be here today with one of our influentials, Kristen Hassen. Kristen has partnered with Pedigree Foundation through the Pedigree brand with this special webinar and safety net toolkit so that you can learn more about how you too can implement a safety net program in your shelter or rescue. Kristen is one of the co-founders and leaders of the Human Animal Support Services Project, a collaborative of more than 2,000 animal welfare organizations and 10,000 individuals that work together to transform animal services in the U.S. and Canada. She also serves on the executive committee of the National Animal Care and Control Association, NACA, helping to bring animal sheltering and animal control into closer alignment to help more people and pets. Prior to her work with Human Animal Support Services, Kristen served as the director of the Pima Animal Care Center, the open admission animal shelter in Tucson, Arizona. In this role, Kristen built the nation's largest shelter pet foster program with more than 5,500 pets going to foster annually, helping them achieve a 92% live release rate. Kristen also served as the deputy director of Austin Animal Center and the assistant director at Fairfax County Animal Shelter. Her areas of expertise include foster care, volunteer programs, shelter pet marketing, the future of animal sheltering, animal welfare innovation and technology, and reducing barriers to pet outcomes. She speaks and writes internationally and has taught hundreds of animal welfare emerging leaders how to increase their impact. She is the recipient of the 2020 Maddie's Hero Award and the 2018 Executive Leader of the Year Award for her work in Tucson. It's my pleasure to introduce a friend, Kristen Hassen.
Thank you so much, Deb, and thanks, Megan. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today for this really important webinar. It's a really tough time in animal welfare, and if you're working or volunteering with animals in any capacity, you know that this is one of the most challenging moments we faced in more than a decade when it comes to pets. I work with a project called the Human Animal Support Services Project, and just wanted to share a quick slide to say it is a club where anyone can join who wants to think differently and imagine a better world for pets and people. These are just some of our basic metrics, and Pedigree Foundation is a crucially important sponsor of this and the work of Austin Pets Alive, so thank you. So we're going to get right into it today because there's so much to cover. And one of the things that we realized after we started Human Animal Support Services is it's not uncomplicated to try to help keep pets and people together, especially in this moment. There are so many barriers that prevent people from keeping their pets even when they want to. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the toolkit. But my goals are really simple. One, I hope you leave here today and go and read the toolkit. We're not going to walk through page by page. I'm hoping you'll go look at the toolkit, and that's what it looks like online. Number two, I hope that you'll go and start and pilot at least one of the programs we're going to talk about. So we're going to go through a lot of different things you can do to help pets in your community and help them stay together. But there are some starting points for you to consider if you're here today thinking about implementing. The first one is a question we really didn't think to ask, and we wish we would have 2 years ago when we started these programs, which is, can people contact your shelter or rescue without physically coming there or calling animal control? If the answer to this is yes, that is great. You are way ahead of the curve. Unfortunately, for a ton of organizations, the answer is still no. People have to come in person. Now, you can still do these programs, but they're much more effective if people can access them prior to physically coming to the shelter with the pet. Number two, do you have the desire to keep pets and people together instead of having them come into the shelter? Do you believe that's the right thing to do in many or most cases? So that's something that we all have to ask ourselves before kind of embarking on this. Many of you, like me, have probably stood in shelter intake lobbies and seen people crying their eyes out. They were losing their housing. They had a vet bill they couldn't afford. There's so many reasons that people bring their pets to surrender. And the heart of the work we do is to say that it shouldn't be that the only way someone could get help is by losing their family member. And so that's really the starting point of all of this. Also, are you willing to try new things? It can feel scary, it can feel overwhelming, and right now nobody has any time, money, or staffing. We know that. Myself and the other folks who've worked on this project, we've all worked in difficult, high volume animal shelters and rescues, and so we know what it's like to lack resources. Are you able and interested in having volunteers be part of it? Most of you all will need volunteers right now. You won't be able to do this on your own with just staff. And so there has to be a willingness to engage volunteers in different ways. And finally, what are your values around what animal sheltering should look like? Do you believe that we should be taking pets away from people who are struggling, or do you think we should be giving them resources to keep them together? Do you believe the best place is in a shelter, or do you believe it's in a home? So those are all things to consider as you start thinking about how you can help pets and people. And most importantly, we all have got to be willing to let go of our own barriers. Now, this is a list, and this is on the Human Animal Support Services website, but it's a list of common barriers and examples of them. And I won't go through all of this, but what we've seen since the pandemic is actually an increase in barriers. And that goes for adoptions and pet surrender and a number of other areas. So it's getting harder to engage with shelters and rescues, and this is a problem. We know outcomes are really low. Outcomes are slower than intake. So there's more animals coming in than leaving. And this puts animals at risk of euthanasia just because of space and resources. So being willing to reconsider those barriers. And I used this photo for a reason. So this is one of the communities that's piloting programs to help pets and people. And this is a family, and they are gathering up supplies to take to a pet food bank. Many organizations would still not allow this. They don't allow children to volunteer. They wouldn't allow people to go off on their own and gather supplies. They wouldn't allow them to work in partnership with the food bank. But this organization broke all those barriers, and now this family can go around their neighborhood and collect food and supplies and get those to the people who need them the most. There was this idea, I started in sheltering in the late 1990s in a shelter with a euthanasia rate around 80%, and it was really sad work. Since then, many of us in the movement have worked to tell the public shelters aren't just places where animals go to die, they're also places of hope and second chances. And while that's true, shelters are still really frightening, traumatic places for pets, even in the best case scenario, even with the very best care. And that's because pets entering shelters are being torn away from their families, their homes, their communities, and everything they've ever known, and being put into a loud, scary kennel with strange smells and noises, oftentimes really not sleeping. So shelters are not the best place for most pets. However, that doesn't mean shelters don't have an important role. The goal of HASS is not to shut down shelters or turn away pets in need. it's to say, we know that about half of animals or more don't actually need to come into the shelter. And if we're able to help them stay in their homes and communities, then we actually are more capable of serving the pets that do enter. The dog that you see in that kennel, that's one of my old staff members, Michelle Figueroa, at Pima Animal Care Center. And we had these larger kennels. They were actually meant for co-housing small dogs, but we ended up using them for an experiment. And what Michelle did is she decided to spend an entire week in a kennel with our longest stay dog. And what happened to Michelle really changed all of us. She became kind of sick. She was incredibly exhausted. She said she couldn't sleep. There was activities happening all night. She had no idea were even occurring. There was dog barking all night. The lights would intermittently come on and off. They were set on auto timers. And Michelle reported that of everything, the stark white walls became really disorienting and disconcerting. Her skin got really oily. She broke out. All of these things happened to her. And moreover, she was still working during the day. And when she was working, she was crying because she was so tired. And it taught us a lot about shelters. Shelters should be safety nets for animals. They shouldn't be places where animals live long term. And Michelle really showed us that through the human perspective. Okay, if any of you have been doing this work for a really long time, before my time, these are some historic photos from the old days of animal sheltering. So this is a drop box. This was actually from one of the communities I used to work in, and you would drop cats on the tops, dogs on the bottom, and as you can imagine, that wasn't very pleasant for the either species, especially the cats. There was just a screen in between the two. And this was how animals were thought of. The idea was that they would be rounded up, they would be brought into the organization, and the vast majority would be euthanized and disposed of. This poster, educational poster about what animal control does, this was actually meant for classrooms, but you can see the role of animal control was to pick up all loose dogs, to destroy unwanted animals, to educate the public, and the point of this was to say keep your dogs confined, because many of you will remember I grew up in Ohio in the 70s and 80s, and we didn't confine most of our dogs. They were still free roaming, but there was a massive decades-long education campaign to get people to confine their dogs, and so that's really a pretty recent phenomenon. Now, does this mean people didn't care about animals in the old days? Does that mean that people just didn't think of pets like families? I used to go around telling everyone, oh, we used to think about pets differently. They were just, you know, working animals, or they just did a job. But what we find when we dig into the history, and there's not very much of it, but we find that people have always loved pets. They have always cared for them, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of where they lived, regardless of any other factors. We have this plethora of historic photos. The first one on the left is a young man and his dog in the 1920s. That's his pet dog. The one in the middle is a Depression era photo of a man and his pet dog. And then on the right, which I just found this one today, I thought it was so interesting. This is from the 1960s, and it's actually a photo. They would do something, and I forget what it was called. It was called like Dog Bath Day, and every spring they would have, people could bring their pet dogs, and they would get treated for fleas and ticks in the spring. And so it's never been true that people didn't care about pets or that things have changed. The system really was set up, though, to separate animals and people. So why does it work this way? Because it doesn't really make sense that it does. We know people love pets. A whopping 98% of pet owners report that they love their pets as much as they love their human family members. They think pets are family. So why does it operate as if pets are disposable property? I'm gonna pause here for just a second and point out two friends who came into a shelter that I worked at, and they're a great example of the problem with the system. These were a bonded pair, a little dog and a little cat, and they had lived together their whole lives. They were brought into the shelter, and we were able to co-house them. The owner couldn't keep them because they were going into an assisted living situation. And right now in the US, There isn't a way to protect the human-animal bond when pet owners go into retirement housing or assisted living housing. And these two, I used to think this picture is so cute. And I look at it now and it kind of breaks my heart because you can just see how confused and sad they look. And I think now, if this was a few years ago, if this happened now, I think we would have done a lot more to try to keep them with their person. So the system works to permanently and completely separate people and pets in order to help the pet. That is the only solution. The way the old pound model works, there is no support or assistance. It is only that you can take the pet away from the person entirely. And our laws and our norms in our communities form the basis for our system. If you go out now and you ask 10 people, what should you do if you find a pet in need? 9 of those 10 are probably still going to tell you that you should bring it to the shelter. If you ask people, what should you do if you have to rehome your pet? Most people are still going to say, bring it to the shelter. So we've really trained our communities in this. It's not that they won't do other things. We've taught them this over now hundreds of years. So animal shelters are just a symptom of this problem. They're not the cause. And they're not a symptom of irresponsible people. They're a symptom of a system that's told people to do the same thing in the same way for all of this time. And so the question we ask with this toolkit is, what could a different world look like? What could it look like if we really started with the idea of the bonds? I want to mention another issue that's really close to my heart, which is the pet that is an owner-requested euthanasia. This category of pet intake, it may happen at your shelter. And what it means is that an owner can bring their pet in, and they can either surrender it or they can surrender it explicitly for the purpose of euthanasia. Now, in cases where that can work effectively, that would be for animals that are truly at the end of their life, where they really need somewhere that they can get affordable euthanasia services. Euthanasia can cost $300 to $500 or more. Many folks just can't afford that. Unfortunately, that's just not how it's used. And so when we look at owner-requested euthanasia pets, the average age is somewhere between 5 and 8 years old. So people are bringing in pets, and the shelter is either sort of forcing them to sign it over for euthanasia, or they're signing it over for euthanasia because they don't want it anymore. And so many of these pets can be saved, but this to me is the best indicator of the problem with the system. So in the shelters I've worked in, you could have someone bring in a 3-year-old pet, owner requested euthanasia, and the staff wouldn't even question it. These are people who love animals, but they've been taught that this is just how the system works. The system just works that you euthanize animals on demand, regardless of if they're healthy or friendly. This is one example of a dog who wasn't euthanized, even though it was an owner-requested euthanasia. But this is kind of the best, the clearest indicator that something's really profoundly broken about the way we think about pets. But a new world is emerging. So if it feels bumpy to you and really terrible right now, perhaps consider what's happening in other industries right now. The mall is dramatically changing. The idea of the office as a work environment is dramatically changing. All of these things that we sort of took for granted, these institutions that we thought were just the way you do things, they're all changing. And so it feels really chaotic yet because we're not quite there yet. We're just beginning to envision a different future. What I share here, this wheel, this is going to take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of work for us to implement. But this is really what we believe the future should look like. And in this future, the shelter isn't the center of the work anymore. The community is the center of the work. And the shelter is just one piece of the pie. It's an important one, but it's only one. And we have all kinds of programs. And so the toolkit, the Pedigree Toolkit is going to show you an introduction to many of these programs that you can do to keep families together. So all of the programs in the toolkit start with 3 words: love. We respect that people come to us because they love their pets. They could leave them, they could get rid of them another way. They come to a shelter or rescue because they love their pets. Care, it's our job to care for not just the pet, but the person at the other end of the leash. And that means taking time to understand the bond between that pet and person and to consider every situation individually. So in the toolkit, we talk a lot about case management and triage. And what that means is that when someone comes to us and they have a pet problem that they believe will result in surrender, we learn more. We ask questions, not just questions on a checklist or a form, but we ask them questions about their life, their circumstances. Are they short-term? Are they long-term? We ask them how long they've had the pet. And in some cases, we decide at the end of that surrender really is the best thing for that pet and person. If somebody's in crisis, they're moving, there's no way they can get their pet back. There's no other family members who can take the pet. But in many cases, we find that we're able to help them stay with their pet. Another program that we talk about as part in the toolkit is safety net fostering and boarding. So during the pandemic, and we did not invent this, actually, shelters just started doing it. But during the pandemic, there were all these people getting COVID and they were having to give up their pets. And so across the industry, what we saw is that people were setting up temporary boarding and fostering programs so that people could keep their pets for that short period. That program has taken off all over. It's low cost. People want to help. It's easy to find fosters for people in short-term crisis. And it's such a great way. It's a win-win because the shelter doesn't have to take the animal in. The animal gets back home and the person gets the help they need. So these programs we talk about, this is one of the easiest ones to start if you're thinking about a starting point, because it has a direct impact on shelter intake right away. Distributing food and supplies. So we run something called pets.findhelp.com, and you should check that out. It's a human services resource platform, but we've now integrated pets into it. So we're the pet part. What we found, and this really surprised me, is that the #1 sought term is for food banks, for pet food resources. That's the #1 thing people are seeking right now. So there is a real need for food distribution, but resources are limited. How do you get the food? Who passes it out? This is a great program for volunteers to help with. Volunteers can do almost every aspect of it, and people love to give. At my last shelter, we were signed up through Amazon, and we got boxes and boxes and boxes every month of donations. And so it's a great program. You'd be surprised at all the places you can get help. And you can also take a lot of things you didn't even know. We would take apples from grocery stores and cut them up for pets for snacks. So there's all kinds of ways you could be really creative about this, but that is in the toolkit as well. So there's lots of other programs. This is a 22-page toolkit, and we know I have one of these cell phones that makes it almost impossible for me to pay attention to any amount of content. So we broke it up into tiny little sections. So you can read one section at a time and come back to it later, but it has everything you need to get started, and it's designed for all levels of staff and volunteers. So if you don't have time, find 3 volunteers, have them read it, and then bring back to you the parts they think will be most useful. So this is just sort of a quick graphic to explain what we imagine the future can look like. But in the old system, as I shared earlier, the pet is given up. And not only does that person not get the pet back, they often don't ever know where that pet ended up. They will never know if their pet lived or died or who it went home with. And whether or not you care about animals, which we probably all do a lot, for humans, that is really a sad thing to go through. If you've ever given up a pet and to not know what happened to it, and it's totally unnecessary. So in the new system, many things can happen. One of those is that the pet could be placed with a temporary foster home and go back home. And then one of the things that we didn't expect to happen is that foster, that person wants to stay involved if that person ever gets into crisis again. So we can start to build safety nets, literal safety nets underneath pets that can last them long into the future. This is a story. There is a Facebook group that I encourage everyone to join and follow. It's called the HASS program at Austin Pets Alive, I think is the name of the page, but it's Positive Alternatives to Shelter Surrender, and you can find it on the Austin Pets Alive website. But what it is it's a platform where people can get help, whether they need to rehome their pet, whether they need financial resources for support, whether they just don't know how to handle a situation, and it's a judgment-free zone. So long before HASS, Austin Pets Alive was doing this incredible program, and it's now Texas-wide. And when you join it, it will tell you so much about the state of what people are living in right now. And it is really a hard moment. Daily, I see listing after listing after listing, housing, eviction, losing my home. Landlord says the pet has to go. So housing is a huge problem right now. People having to move for work, move into smaller places and rehome their pets. Behavior, not because there's anything wrong with that pet, but because the conditions animals are having to live in, particularly dogs, is really making things challenging. So this is a story from that page. And this was a woman who, her beloved service dog had a foreign body, an impacted object, needed surgery, and she didn't have money and didn't get approved for care credit. How many of you know someone that's been in this exact same situation? So because of the page, she was able to go on, and the moderators, who were all volunteer up until I think this year, the moderators were able to help her do a GoFundMe so that she could raise the funds she needed to get her dog help. And that's how things could look. This person really needs her pet as much as her pet needs her, but without these safety net support systems, she would have turned that pet into the shelter and no one probably ever would have known the story. And that's the real, when we think about the history of animal welfare, how many stories, how many bonds between pets and people have been lost. And it doesn't have to be that way. So in conclusion, this is the hardest part of all of this. And I think that as a 3-time government shelter director, once under a police department, and once in a community that was faced severe poverty within the community, I think that the lessons I've learned are that we've got to change our own behaviors before we look at trying to help other people. So I'm going to just give you a couple of the things that I've learned really work. I work with hundreds of shelter directors around the country, and these are the things that really work. One, we have to start saying yes more. We as an industry are addicted to the word no, and we've got to change that. And my challenge to you would be try to not say no for a week and say yes, or find a way to get to yes instead. 1 week, it's going to be hard. Take positive risks. Our industry is tremendously risk adverse for a number of reasons, but when someone comes to you with an idea or you want to pilot a program, you as the leader of the organization or a leader in the organization are probably going to think of all the things that could go wrong, but instead think about all the things that could go right, and then think about your 2 or 3 biggest potential risks and how you're going to mitigate for those. But don't let those be a reason to not try something new. Reflect on your own bias, and I used a photo that may not make any sense why it's in this presentation. So when you see this photo, consider, what do you think when you see this picture? Now, you may, if I asked you, you'd probably have a bunch of different answers, but I'm going to tell you the story is that we had rescued 26 former fighting roosters. And these roosters had never seen the light of day. They were so sad. Some of them were injured. This one actually was really injured. And we normally would have just euthanized them. I mean, the way of handling roosters was ending their life, often in pretty terrible ways. And there was this belief that you couldn't rehome them. But we put them up for adoption. We microchipped everyone. Put them up for adoption, and we thought we might get 1 or 2 adopted, and we had a line out the door that day, so many people wanting to come and save a rooster, and they all told us these stories about why they loved roosters so much. This is one of the families that rescued one of the roosters, and this was, oh gosh, 5 or 6 years ago, and I can still walk around Austin. One of the people that rescued one, he rides around on his shoulder. So question your own beliefs and your own bias and your own thoughts, because you're often wrong, and one bad experience shouldn't mean that you make a policy that could really impact a lot of lives. Make piloting the norm. So in a really healthy shelter that's working well, you should be trying new things every single day and then tracking if they work or not. And be ready to fail. You're going to fail a lot, and that's another thing we're really scared of, but that's a normal part of growth, and it's okay if you do. Everything should start with the idea of maintaining the bond between the pet and the person. So intake should really only happen after we've failed to maintain that bond. And last two, put yourself in their shoes and say thank you to people for coming to you. It takes so much bravery to come to an institution and to tell them you have a problem. And there's an expression, but for the grace of God go I, and I looked it up this morning. It's actually from the 16th century. Someone said that quotation when they were watching a number of prisoners on their way to be executed. Interesting, I didn't know that. But that phrase comes back to me again and again and again, because none of us are different than the people we're helping, but we imagine that we are. We imagine somehow we're protected from needing help. We're protected from those resources. And that's just not true. In this world, people's lives are more precarious than ever. And we need to be really aware of that as we help, we should also be engaging those people in how they can help. Maybe they can tell someone in their community about a resource. Maybe they can eventually volunteer. But really, you'll know you've succeeded when the helpers and the people needing help are the same people. And I say thank you, one, because it's scary for people to come to you for help. Two, because bringing a pet to surrender and then being brave enough to want to try to keep it, that takes a real love. People come to you in crisis, and if they're willing to give it a try, that's something we need to really honor and celebrate. So thank you so much. We're gonna stop here, take some time for questions. And the project is Human Animal Support Services, so I hope you'll visit the website. There's so much information there. We're going to provide the link to the toolkit, and you can find me. This is actually my last week at Human Animal Support Services, and I'll be providing some direct support for shelters in need, and you can find me at Kristen at outcomesforpets.com. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook, so I write and talk about this stuff all the time. I'm so passionate about it, and I want to hear your stories too. So if you are doing some of these things, please reach out and tell me about them. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kristen. We have a lot of questions. I also have on the call with us today some of our Essential Support Dog Safety Net Award recipients that were able to join. And I just thought of those of you that are on the call, if you'll raise your hand, if you want to share some of the things that you're doing in your community. I just love us putting real examples out there that people are doing. And because we're all facing so many different challenges. So I will start looking to see for a couple of those folks.
And did I stop sharing? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I know, and we'll do questions too.
If you are here and you are a Human Animal Support Services pilot shelter, or you are one of the recipients of these grants, yeah, we really want to hear what you're doing and any questions that you have too. We're here all the time to answer questions, but we know that people are dealing with really practical challenges right now, and I want to give a shout out to our incredible pilot shelters. There's 22 shelters around the United States who agreed to all try all of this together. And so we're in the middle of piloting all these programs. And we've learned so many cool lessons over the last few years.
And so we'll just go to a question now. Suggestion for pet parent co-ownership, especially for those who travel or are senior citizens.
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and one that I don't think would have gotten asked a few years ago, so thank you. It tells me how far we've come. So there's a growing movement to have co-ownership of pets. I know I can never leave. My wife and I have 6 dogs, 4 little ones, 2 big ones. We can never go anywhere. It's so hard to find a pet sitter, and for a lot of people, we're traveling for work, or we have different things in our lives that we cannot have a full-time pet. So pet sharing is a great way to try something different so that you can have a pet in your life. And it can be done in a number of ways. One person can foster, the other person can own. In the case of older adults, they may not be equipped to have a pet full time. They may not be in a living situation where they can have a pet full time, but they can sometimes. And so I'm really passionate about people not losing their pets when they go into assisted living situations. But right now, there's no laws to protect their relationship with their pets and the bond. And so that's one situation in which you may be able to negotiate with an assisted living facility that somebody could have a pet 2 days and you would have it the other 5. But there's lots of ways to do that. And we really want to share as people are having co-owned pets. And as far as agreements around that, I think everyone is individual, and this is such new ground. We're just going to be collecting information on how it's going and what people are finding.
Next question, please discuss ways to keep community cats out of the shelter. Those which are unowned or quasi-owned are still at risk and not getting sterilized.
So cats are, out of every 3 animals euthanized in a shelter, 2 of them are still cats. And I think that it's so strange. I've been in a position for the last 8 years to be in communities where we don't bring in healthy outdoor cats, regardless of whether they're friendly or feral. They just don't come in. They go right through spay, neuter, and return. And so it's easy to forget that in so many places those cats come in, and for the ones that are not immediately friendly, they're at risk of dying just because they entered the shelter. And so it's long past due that we should just be handling outdoor cats through spay, neuter, return, and the ones that come in are the ones that really need to be there. So when you do have that set up, what you see is you have a shelter full of tiny kittens, older cats with medical issues, and you get to save those. What happens now, because we take in so many cats, is that then cats with medical issues that are totally treatable and manageable, like FELV and FIV and others, those cats are immediately euthanized because of the volume, and they don't need to be. So we really advocate, at least at us, American Pets Live and Human Animal Support Services, that healthy outdoor cats stay outdoors.
Thanks, Kristen. So suggestions for programs to support rescues for after shelter hours and transport.
I'm not entirely sure what that question means. So
let's see, many time constraints and funding resources or barriers to rescue can be remedied with a shelter liaison to coordinate pickup or transport, especially when the shelter is closed.
Oh, well, I mean, so I would just say volunteers are great folks to do that. Now, if the shelter is closed, I think that would be a fairly particular situation. In most shelters, you wouldn't even be able to get in if the shelter was closed. The after hour thing is a real question. And I'm not sure the answer. I just ran data on how many hours shelters are open for intake versus how many hours are open for outcomes. And it was really interesting. Most shelters were open more for intake than for outcomes. Many shelters were only open 3 to 4 hours a day. And then even then, they were only open for certain days of the week. And so we really have to think about, what do we do with animals 24/7 when situations happen when they need care? And I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all approach. I think it's something that we need to keep trying to figure out. We probably need larger community coalitions. So if you're a rescue group, we probably need to be working with multiple other groups and the shelter to have an overarching plan for pets, not during open hours. And the communities that do this best do have those community coalitions. It's hard to do this work in isolation. And you mentioned financial barriers to rescue. It's been hugely impactful. I believe rescue, transfer, and transport is still down about 16%. Something like 1 million animals impacted last year who weren't transported. And we don't know yet, but we think a lot of that is due to Rescue groups just don't have the financial resources and the ability to pull animals the way that they could prior to the pandemic.
That's super helpful. Here is another question. Characteristics of the big-headed mixes are typical for long stays. Can you discuss ways to promote the longest stays in programs? Warehouse and long durations are unkind and the dogs deteriorate. This is taking a toll on the shelter staff too. Please discuss this and transport.
Okay, I'll give the really quick answer to that because it's a long answer. Big dogs in shelters are there because of housing restrictions, period. And I just want to repeat that. Big dogs are in shelters because of housing restrictions, period. Pet fees, landlord restrictions, breed bans, the list goes on and on. When you work in a shelter, you'll find that people come in and day out wanting to adopt medium and large dogs, and they can't because of these restrictions. So part of what we need to do and what this webinar is really about is keeping more of them out in their homes and their communities, and really reducing the number that enter. A lot of big dogs enter that really just don't need to, particularly when we consider that 60% of dogs entering shelters are lost or stray, and return rates are very low once they enter the shelter. And I do just want to touch on the fact that you're asking about marketing them to get them out. I partnered with the Maddie's Million Pet Challenge to do a big dog masterclass. We did that earlier this year. It's 8 hours of content and it's really fast. It's like 25-minute presentation after 25-minute presentation. You can access it on the Maddie's Pet Forum or on the Million Pet Challenge website. And it's really, those are really helpful classes. And we also have a giant resource list on the Maddie's Million Pet Challenge website. That resource list is everything I know about getting big dogs out of shelters alive, all in one page. It's just link after link after link. It's like things that really work, things that don't. That's a great resource to use in your staff training. And so that's a good one. It is a really long topic because it's almost like you can't be successful in adoption and foster if no one who wants the animals can have them. It's a little bit like you can kind of think about potbelly pigs and big dogs the same way now. A lot of people think potbelly pigs are super cute and would take one home, but they're going to get them home. Their landlord's going to be like, absolutely not. That's what happens with big dogs, particularly pit bull dogs. And so that's why I'm currently doing work, and many of us are. The HABRI, which is the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, is leading the way along with Michelson and others on housing. And I think that, you know, we have so much work to do. That's going to be a decades-long fight because animal shelters right now are subsidizing those restrictions. We're paying the price for those restrictions and they're totally unnecessary. So some of it is just going to be being savvy and creative and awesome and trying to get animals out.
Great. And then I think Tanya wants us to mention the Austin Pets Alive Community Facebook group again, just so she knows where to go.
Yeah, they just changed the name, but I think it's Austin Pets Alive PASS program or PASS program at Austin Pets Alive. It stands for Positive Alternatives to Shelter Surrender. And if you're like, what, I don't even understand what you're saying, go to the Austin Pets Alive website and you can click on it's like the resources link and you'll see it right there. It takes you right to the group. But join that group. Holy cow, it's almost like reading the news because you can see the trends and what's impacting people. And it's statewide through Texas now, so it's not just here in Austin. So you can really see the scope of the problems. And I will say that I am worried. I am really worried seeing what's happening to folks right now.
It says, and this one says, discuss mandatory spay, neuter, and mandatory microchipping.
Okay, that's a great question. So here in Austin, we have an organization called Emancipet. If you don't know them, look them up. They're so cool. They provide free spay neuter to many folks, very low discounted spay neuter to many folks, and vaccines as well. Emancipet's been here for something like 15 years. They're open at least 5 days a week, and they provide these resources. None of it's mandatory, but all these years later, doing this all this time, they cannot accommodate every person that needs help. There's always more people that want and need help than there are people that can get it. So that is the best case scenario for a community. And given that that's the case, we have looked all over the country, and what we find is that the resources to provide sterilization always outweigh or are always less than the desire of people. People want to get their pets spayed and neutered. It's gross to have unspayed and neutered pets in your house. The vast majority of people want this and can't get those services. They're not accessible. So what we would say is focus on making those services accessible. And while we don't support any sort of mandatory measures at all, because they're not necessary, what we would say at American Pets Alive and the Human Animal Support Service is, if you are going to have mandatory services, let's say you're going to say every animal has to be spayed and neutered, you need to determine how you will provide that at no cost to the community. If you're going to mandate it, how do you provide it? We haven't found a community where that's possible. But that doesn't mean you can't help people get on that page to get their pets sterilized. Just talking to them about it. There's a lot of mythology still out there, but that isn't really the biggest issue. The biggest issue is access to care, and we have a veterinary shortage. So if we implement a bunch of mandatory measures and there's nobody to do the spay and neuter, we find ourselves really not in any better place. But with people getting cited for something, there's no way they can solve.
I'm looking through our questions tab, and we've got a lot of great suggestions from the team, from everybody that's joining the call. I'm just looking for another question here. Please share info on programs funding for pet owners that are ill or in hospice.
Oh gosh, so we have, our population, we are going to have more older adults, we have people living longer, and we know, everybody knows now, pets are good for your health, right? And there's some research to say, well, yeah, in most cases, that's not always entirely true, but pets that live with you and are your companion are good for your health, they make you happier, you live longer, etc. And yet we have people who are torn away from their pets every single day. Simply because they are going into housing or hospitalization and they can't keep their pet. So number one, and the toolkit can help you with this, you need to have things set up for those crisis situations. We would have, in Tucson in particular, we would have people who, they were imminently at risk of death. They needed hospital care, they needed surgery. They would not get it until they knew their pets were safe. And you can do this a whole variety of ways. You can have volunteers go pet sit for them. You can have someone foster their pet. You can have them bring that pet to the hospital and visit them if it's allowed. So there's so many different ways we can help. But for longer term situations, we as a nation have got to really invest in creating some protections for the support for older adults and their pets. It is just inhumane to people and animals to tear them apart when they are medically struggling. Now, there's some parameters to that, right? Someone probably can't keep their 6 big huskies with them, but that's not really the norm. The norm is that there should be reliable accommodations made. So that's another thing that we need to fight for. And if you want to look for a good example of that, check out the Animal Justice Party. They are located in Victoria, Australia, and they do incredible work. They've actually passed some protections for older adults who are entering hospitalization, assisted living, et cetera, that they can stay with their pets.
That's awesome. Thanks, Kristen. Here's another one from Arizona that's dedicated to the same mission as you are, using various methods to help keep pets and their parents together. Let's see. Are you interested in expanding to Arizona? To clarify, the Phoenix, Scottsdale, Arizona area.
Oh my gosh, Maricopa is one of the hardest places in the United States. I think the dog intake is maybe the highest or second highest in the entire US. It's something like 30 to 35,000 dogs. However, just like with Los Angeles, the per capita intake isn't all that high. It's astronomical numbers, but there's also lots of people that live in those places. So in those communities, there are lots of people that want big dogs. The problem in LA is a little different than the problem in Arizona, but housing restrictions are certainly playing a part. And I think that the mega shelters in these big cities are going to have to evolve. I'm not sure, this may be a little too early to predict, but what I imagine is that we're not going to see mega shelters that hold 500 to 1,000 to 1,500 dogs. We're not going to see them survive long into the future. They are too not friendly to customers. how does anyone walk in a shelter and face that many dogs? So what we imagine is a more disseminated system where you would have smaller centers in different parts of the community. Maricopa, it's just like LA, there's huge places. So having more organizations in different places in the community is probably a solution. And yes, I try to help Maricopa as much as I can. And I know a bunch of folks there who are doing awesome work.
Yeah, that's awesome. And here's one. Are there webinars or tutorials on how to gather key data and how to interpret them when either creating a pilot program or improving an existing one?
Yeah, there's a document that we wrote. It's on the Human Animal Support Services website. And I think maybe, I don't know if Deb and Megan, if we can do this, maybe we can get a list of links that we can send to everybody afterwards, because I know I'm going through a lot of resources. But there's a document called How to Pilot a Program, and it's really simple. Like when you're thinking about tracking data, think simple. Like if you're nervous and you want to pilot, let's say you want to pilot a program where you're going to provide access to medical care. You are going to take referrals from the emergency vet for people that cannot afford the medical care to save their pet. Let's just imagine that's what you're doing. Something we did and it was life-changing. What we found out at the emergency vets, it's actually destroying them to have to euthanize people's pets when they can't afford it. So let's say you're going to do that. Try it for 2 weeks. Say we're going to do 10 animals a week. Here's going to be the basic criteria. Pick 2 or 3 things. 10 animals a week, and we're going to figure out what happens. How much money did we spend? What did our vet think? And what was the outcome? It doesn't have to be complicated to track data. Even if you're doing a bigger pilot, keep it really simple and think about what really matters here. I used to pilot programs to send euthanasia listed behavior dogs to foster care. This is when I worked for a police department. Well, talk about risk, right? So one of the things that we tracked is the longevity of placement and how the dogs did over the long term. So we actually, after they were placed, we checked back in with the fosters and the adopters over time, and we were able to show that those dogs were not more likely to bite or cause harm than other shelter dogs. But that was a really important metric, even though we might not have initially thought of it.
That's super helpful. And then, okay, last question, and then we'll kind of wrap up for today. So here's this one. Do any other shelters have designated funds for medical care for community-owned animals? We can barely cover our own costs, and we hear mixed reviews on whether people will support care for owned pets. There's still the view that if they can't afford a pet, they shouldn't have one. So we've been hesitant to go broad with the idea. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, you should be fundraising within your community to provide this. People do want to support it. Some people don't. Some people think that anyone that can't afford their vet bill shouldn't have a pet. But that's not true of everyone. And there are a lot of philanthropists within communities that want to support this. It really is most effective when you can tell stories. And when you can start with more sympathetic stories. I remember we had a gentleman who was disabled and in a wheelchair, and his service dog was gored by a javelina in Arizona. And it really wasn't his fault. The dog got picked up, he went to the hospital, the dog went to the shelter, and the dog would have died. He couldn't afford to have that dog go to the emergency vet, so it came to the shelter where it got life-saving care, and we were able to return that dog to him. And the reunion between those two still makes me cry, like even just thinking about it. It was so beautiful. But that was a case where we knew we had something that was going to pull at people's heartstrings. So think about that strategically. When you get that next story that you're like, oh, wow, this one just gets to me, share it, share that story. That's how you start raising funds. And it's actually quite easy. We did this program. I tried to find a picture of this and didn't have time, but we did this program. I want to say 2 more things. Tailor the programs to your own community. So we gave you this guide. Thank goodness for Pedigree Foundation pushing us to make this really simple and accessible. This guide can be read by anyone in your org. It's going to give you the basics. But when you think about providing support, almost think of it like a big painting, and everyone's contributing, and you're all contributing within your community to make a big, beautiful mural. That means that you're going to think about things that are relevant in your own community. So For us, we realized that there are a lot of people experiencing homelessness. They all love their dogs, like some of the most well-cared dogs I've ever seen, except for one thing. The pads of their paws were really burned because it's so hot there and they walk so much. And so our friends group, the Friends of Female Animal Care Center, a great example, they raise a couple million a year for these programs. They got doggy tennis shoes for every darn homeless dog in Tucson. And so when you drive around there in the summer now, everybody's dogs are like outfitted in their booties, and they're totally fine. Well, that was a program that was really relevant. Like if we were in Michigan, it probably would have been like sweaters and warm something. And so think about programs in your community, look around you and look at what are the biggest problems. This isn't something, you don't need to overthink this. Like find a place where there's suffering, where there's separation that you don't think needs to be there, and just start trying something. Pup and Boots ended up being a huge fundraising tool too. People just loved it. And now people take pictures all the time when they see the dog. So for donors, they have a visual representation of what of the care that they're offering. Last thing I want to say is that you know, we're really grateful to Pedigree Foundation. It has been keeping the focus on dogs, and especially big dogs, is so important right now. And it can be easy to forget that there's all these dogs that still really need us, whether they need to be kept in their homes or they need to go to a new loving home. Right now, we have something like 300 to 350,000 animals in shelters. More than 100,000 of those are loving, adoptable dogs. So I wanted to thank Pedigree Foundation, not just for doing the toolkit, but for being here for dogs that are homeless, dogs that are loved, but their owners are struggling, and all of our pet dogs. So I'm really grateful for your time coming. And again, I'm still here. Find me on Facebook and LinkedIn. I talk about this stuff all the time, and I want to hear your stories too. So please send those. And thank you, Megan, and thanks so much, Deb.
Kristen, it's been a pleasure to have you here. Every time I engage with you, listen to you, I always learn something new. You are just a wealth of information. Your experience is amazing. So everyone that's on this call, if you do have questions, please do reach out to Kristen. I mean, I reach out to her every now and then and ask her, like, what do you think? Should we do a program around this as far as a grants related initiative? And she's always been so helpful, immediately responds to me. And so I'm just so grateful for you to be on this call and, you know, just share your wealth of information. So thank you for that.
Yes, same for me. I just echo Deb on that, Kristen. And then just for all that have joined us today, I will be sending out a copy of the recording of this presentation and the toolkit itself. And then Kristen, if you and I will work together, and we'll put together like just a short list of links, and we can include that as well. So thank you guys for tuning in and for listening to us. Always reach out if you have any questions. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Have a great day, guys.